Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We'll make a start. We're just past 2 o'clock. Welcome to a new event for the Northern Ireland Statistics and Research Agency, but not a new event for the Economic and Social Research Council. Welcome to it's the Economic and Social Research Council Social Science Festival, and for those who are IT literate in the audience, the ESRC would like for those to tweet what their views are, not just in terms of this presentation, but more generally in terms of social science, using the hashtag ESRC Festival. So for those who are up to speed with these things, that's the hashtag for today. Can I welcome everybody, and can I welcome our two speakers, one of whom most people in the audience will know well, a friend of NISRA, Dr Ian Shuttleworth from Queen's University, who is the Director of the Northern Ireland Longitudinal Study Research Support Unit. And the other is Dr Oliver Duke Williams from the University College in London. Both gentlemen have been long friends of the Census of Population in the United Kingdom. I remember meeting Ollie 12 years ago, 11 years ago in Newcastle in relation to a product called Wicked, is that right? Wicked, which at the time was a bit really rather quite an interesting title for a longitudinal, or sorry, a interaction data set relating to the Census of Population. Both Oliver and Ian are going to speak for half an hour this afternoon. I think it's Ian first, and then Oliver, on I think a really quite an interesting subject around the development of the internet in terms of the Census of Population. The Census of Population, largest single statistical exercise undertaken in the United Kingdom, and the last census in 2011 had for the first time the opportunity for people to go online to provide their response in that way. Ian's going to look at that from a Northern Ireland perspective in terms of the responses here, and then Oliver's going to look at it with respect to sort of a longitudinal aspect. There are plenty of opportunities for some questions at the end. If you've got some questions as you go along, I'm sure Ian or Oliver will take those. But thank you very much, and I'm going to hand over to Ian first.
Thank you, David. In framing what we're talking about today, the analysis that I'm reporting is cross-sectional, and it's about what happened in 2011. Ollie's looking at what happened to people in 2001 and what they were like then, whether they answered the census, and then whether they responded using the internet in 2011. So it's longitudinal in that sense. In thinking about the sort of broad issues and about what the topic really means in terms of its implications, it's obviously got importance, I think, in terms of what happened to the 2021 census, given the recommendations that have been made about it being largely internet-based. But also, as well, perhaps wider implications could be about engagement, engagement of citizens with government too. So finding out who can engage electronically and who can't as well. So it's not directly about that, but it does throw some light on that and would probably sort of give some useful indicators. So those, I think, are its sort of implications more broadly. First of all, just some introductory comments about the analysis and a little bit about the census. As you all know, there's been a population census for about 200 years in Britain and Ireland. And for the vast majority of this time, really excepting the last census, the censuses have been paper-based. So people have gone out with forms, you've had enumerators heading out, and then you also had latterly self-completed questionnaires. The 2011 census, for the first time, saw the option to engage with it via the internet. So the 2011 census was different because there was an optional way to respond by using the internet rather than filling in a paper-based questionnaire. That's really sort of part of a wider international context and a wider international background. Because, as we know, in places like New Zealand, Canada and the United States, there has been use of the internet to engage with the population for surveys and for censuses. So it's really part of a wider international move as well, towards moving towards electronic data collection and electronic engagement with the population by statistical agencies. Now, why is that? Well, it's seen as reducing data collection and processing costs. So internet engagement, electronic engagement, is seen as being important in terms of cutting the costs of actually handling data and getting the data in. It's been argued by some that internet collected data is more accurate. You can design forms on the internet, so there's some element of preparatory editing, so you can check certain things, or if you put a certain value in, questions could be raised. So greater accuracy. But it's been argued by some as well that it's a way to reduce respondent burden. So an easy way to get out, to get there to people, make it easy for them to answer, to get better quality data, and to reduce the costs of actually handling the data before you get the results out. Now, obviously in the UK context, there's more value attached to the census, to the internet route, and greater importance, simply because of the recommendations made early this year about the England and Wales census by ONS, that it should be predominantly online, albeit supplemented by administrative data sources. So that's sort of like the first and most relevant thing, the first most immediate point. So we need to learn and see what's happened in 2011. Plus, the secondary point I was making, which just sort of occurred to me, was this sort of thing about e-government and wider engagement with citizens via the internet. So it makes it all the more important, basically, to understand more about the take-up of the optional internet response route in 2011. And so this presentation basically just sets out to consider who responded to the 2011 Northern Ireland census and from where via the internet. So it's giving you basic facts, basic data and some preliminary descriptive analysis to give a sense of the types of people and where they're from and how they interacted with the census in 2011. First of all, I think I'll just sort of sit down and relax a little bit. Why not, eh? I'll just take the weight off the feet. First of all, there's a lot of literature. There's a wider literature on digital divides and market research and survey methodologies, which is sort of pertinent and sort of relevant for this. It's not directly relevant, but it's sort of quite relevant. I need to take more account of that actually when I'm writing the work up and developing it. But there is quite an extensive literature and reports on the New Zealand and Canadian censuses and the American Unity Survey, and reports from ONS about what's happened in England and Wales as well. So I'm drawing on that, and particularly the stuff, sort of from New Zealand and Canada and the United States. But it should be considered in this wider literature. And what I've done in the next slide, I've put together a little table. I'm trying to look at the sorts of people who aren't picked up in internet routes, in internet data collection exercises, and I've tried to compare them and contrast them with groups which are probably considered to be traditionally hard to enumerate in traditional paper-based censuses. So I'll just spend some time looking and considering some of these points here. And actually, I'm quite interested to hear what you think of this table and what you think of some of the categories that I've put down here. And basically, I suppose the bottom line, the sort of headline here, is basically that different types of people will have different types of problem, and there'll be different issues in reaching social groups according to whether you use paper or electronic routes. So looking down here, I think in the hard to enumerate in the census, obviously young people are often hard to get hold of. They're hard to get hold of and to locate with the census and to get a paper response from. Students are typically difficult to handle. People in communal establishments, people who live in flats. We expect there are high rates of problems in certain urban areas, typically inner cities and deprived areas, high rates of imputation. Ethnic minority groups are often considered to be difficult. Renters, sometimes single-person households, and the unemployed. So there are issues actually in getting hold of people and getting paper censuses to work with them. Now, of course, one issue isn't just the channel of using the paper, but it's actually contacting them and getting hold of them and actually making them aware of the census and getting into certain areas and getting hold of certain demographic groups and getting into certain places. So there's issues there which isn't just to do with the mode of response, but to actually do with the identification of areas and people and places. But it's interesting to note that the people who tend to fall out in electronic data collection in the literature tend to be the older. So no surprises there. Older people. The less educated. So there's an education divide. There's an education gradient in the use of the internet and responses to surveys and data collection exercises via the internet. I put down there flat dwellers in communal establishments question marks. I simply don't know, it's not clear in the literature what it says about that, but trying to do an internet-based data collection in a communal establishment would, I imagine, in some cases be pretty difficult. In terms of the internet, it's rural areas that are difficult. So rural areas, remote areas, areas with poor digital infrastructure, areas which are remote, which are problematic. Ethnic minority groups can be difficult in the census now, but actually in terms of using the internet, it's often non-ethnic minority groups, e.g. majority groups. In the Northern Ireland context, the white Northern Irish population, which tends to be more difficult, which didn't respond so readily using the internet. Owner-occupiers. But there are some overlaps in terms of social deprivation, hindering internet responses. Smaller households, and the unemployed being less likely to use the internet. So there's a number of things that could be going on here. I mean, obviously, to get people to respond to the internet census, you've got to locate the people, you've got to solicit their cooperation. So some of the problems, which we see on the left-hand side here, will happen, no doubt, in trying to get hold of people for internet data collection as well. Yeah? But then, in addition to that, when you get hold of them via the internet, there's a slightly different demographic of interaction with the data collection system, which isn't exactly the same as that. It might add to it, it might be additive upon this, or it might sort of slightly kick against it or interact with it. I've not really thought that through and considered how that would work out. I think you can probably sort of think of some of the possible implications for what it might mean if we were using the internet and going down the internet route. So there are some rough thoughts which really sort of started to, which have informed what I'm saying today, and actually sort of partly informed the analysis that I've done. And I want to say, thank you. I did say it in the sort of first slide and actually meant to, but thanks for all this to the Census Office and particularly to you there who helped me do all this work as well. So thanks very much for that. I did say that first one, I actually meant to say that. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the data and the methods and what we did. The analysis was undertaken on a 90% sample of the counted 2011 census. So we don't have people who have been imputed or added in by other means. And I made a number of assumptions, or we made a number of assumptions. We took the household reference person as the most relevant person to consider demographically. In most cases, the vast majority of cases, there was one form per household. So one form, and we assume the household reference person was a person who filled it in. So it was their demography that was most important in determining what happened and the route that was chosen, whether paper-based was used or internet was used. And the literature informed the choice of variables. So we know things like rurality is important. We know things like age is important. We know things like deprivation is potentially important, yeah? But we also put other things in, basically on an exploratory basis, just to see what else was happening in the data set. So this is an exploratory type of analysis. We coded the census response via the internet as 1, 0 if it was by paper. So it's a binary outcome. So what we did in the end, we did some cross-tabulations, which is a good way to handle category data like that. And then we did some logistic regression analysis too, because that's the way to handle binary outcome dependent variables, outcome variables. Note, there are some limitations with the analysis. So the people who responded via the internet includes those who have a computer and have broadband and chose to respond by the internet. People who are physically able to respond and who choose to do so. The 0 includes those who had the above and chose not to respond via the internet. And it also includes those who didn't have computer and broadband. Ideally, what would have been really useful would have been to have done a 2-stage analysis. What we've done now, people who responded via the internet versus those who responded via paper, but then also to have done the analysis on the base of just those who owned computers or who had broadband or were known to be IT users. Yeah? So there are limitations. And we can't do anything about it because, unlike in the Republic of Ireland, there was no question in the UK census on whether households own computers and whether they own broadband. So we can't deal with that here. So there's a limitation in that sense. So we have to be aware of that. Independent variables, so of course the usual things then. Gender, age, country of birth, education, economic status, housing tenure, car ownership as a proxy for affluence or wealth of a household. Folks, not such a good proxy. It's something that we use, we experimented with. Religion, because it's important in a Northern Ireland context. Illness, so there's general illness questions across the UK, which apply to all parts of the UK, but also the specific questions in Northern Ireland on different sorts of health conditions. And finally, we looked at the change of address the year before the census as well. So we looked at that too. So that was the beginning. These are the results. So this is the responses, the rates, not the absolute numbers, but rate by age. And it runs all the way through from 16 filled there, all the way to the very old age groups. And it's really just what we would expect to see internationally or in England and Wales. Interestingly, the peak sort of response seems to be here, late 20s, early 30s. When you get to my sort of age down here, it's rapidly falling. The overall response via the internet, the overall percentage of forms returned by the internet was about 15% in Northern Ireland. It's actually slightly lower than it was in England and Wales. There's maybe some questions as to why that is. And it's only speculation I've got as to why that might be. Now, this is my attempt here to try to overcome the problem that we don't know whether people own computers or have broadband. So what we have here are broad age groups, roughly 10-year age groups. And what I did was I got the counts of people from a survey, a government survey, I actually forget exactly which one it is now, but people who have access to a computer and use broadband. So I know the rates of people by these age groups. I applied those rates then to the census population to calculate the expected numbers of people if those rates apply by age in the census who would own a computer or who would have broadband. And then I used those bases then to calculate the response rate via the internet, the percentage of internet returns. So basing on everybody, all the population, the green column here, you can see it's got quite a strong fall off with age, and it gets down to about 5% for those 70 and over. If we control for people having a computer or broadband we make the assumption that we can use those rates to estimate the numbers of people in the census who got a computer and have broadband per age group, we see that the rates are much higher, first of all. We see they do decrease with age, but they don't decrease half as quickly. This suggests that there is a less willingness for older people to respond to the census via the internet than younger people, but that decrease is exaggerated because older people simply don't have computers in some cases, or simply don't have broadband. So the decrease here is exaggerated by simple physical constraints. So controlling for those who've got internet, those who've got broadband, the rates are somewhat higher. And even for the older age group, they're over 15%, or around 15%, depending whether you use those with a computer or those with broadband. So I thought that was an interesting sort of different take. And it's a way partly to deal with the criticism that we don't have information on whether people have broadband or not. Here's a map, and the darker areas are those. This is a super output area map. These are areas, the darker areas are those with higher rates of internet response. Now the interesting thing here is the highest area is 54%, the lowest area is 6.9%. And actually, that range, if you can correct me, Ollie, is actually pretty similar to what's been seen in England and Wales. So it's pretty similar. And you all know Northern Ireland, you probably know it better than me, but you see there's roughly an east-west sort of pattern around Belfast. And you also see there's an urban pattern, an urban-rural pattern. And actually, I haven't put it into this presentation, but actually if you had the map of the proximity domain of the index of multiple deprivation, you would see that in areas which are actually sort of deemed to be fairly deprived out here, what you'd see is that they're in that sort of area. So that's the sort of rurality dimension that's being picked up in other analyses and other commentary of this topic. So, I'll just run you through some of the sort of key results. I'll just explain these just to make sure that I get this right. I took the percentages here, and I set in the multiple regression, I had a reference category, in this case 2 persons, yeah? I presented the percentages, the raw percentages, as a ratio of the reference category here, so in the raw results. So the raw results, I've taken the percentages there as a ratio of the reference category used in the multivariate results. I've actually got the raw data and the raw figures actually in the paper that I'd written. But what I wanted to do was to show you that there were like raw differences, a sort of relative differences across groups. And I wanted then to show what happened to those differences when you tried to control for various other factors in the logistic regression model. And I picked out some of the sort of key and biggest differences. First thing is family size. Family size is associated with higher internet returns elsewhere. So we see the same thing here. If we're thinking about 2021, one of the interesting things will be the effects of changing household composition if there are more small single-person households. So an interesting thing will be what will be the outcomes of social change by 2021 and how will that drive and alter this sort of pattern that we see later on. The key point here is that the differentials remain even after we control for other background factors. So I suppose we can say that they're, quotes, real differences. It's not just an artifact of the data. It's not just a fact that we've not controlled for certain things to do with large families. Ditto for age. So this is just sort of by age group here, with the reference category, those 45 to 54. You can see these are big differentials still by age. But for the older people, that difference is being artificially inflated simply because older people don't have access to computers and broadband. Now, one thing that we're looking for, I'm thinking about in terms of 2021, is that some of those older people who don't have computers will have died. Some of the younger people in the earlier age groups will have aged into those older age groups. And the question then is will they keep their broadband and computer access and usage up at the same rate as they had 10 years before? If so, that means that that sort of structural change may start to lift the possibility of response rates and maybe ease that age differential. That's something to consider. I don't know the answer. Obviously, big qualifications differential, so those with degrees or any qualifications are actually far more likely to respond to the census via the internet than those with no qualifications. And these differences are still maintained even when we control for other confounding or other background factors. So if you say that they're standardised as 1, people with GCSEs are over twice as likely in the raw data, and there's something like 1.4 times as likely in the adjusted data. So qualifications are important. Proximity, so we had quintiles of deprivation, of isolation from, in terms of the proximity domain. And we see there, actually, that when we control for a lot of the composition of the population, these remoter areas, the differential's actually bigger. It's actually wider than it is sort of in the raw percentages. Religion, this is only something specific for Northern Ireland, but there's something happening with people who've got no religion. Now we've looked at things like age. People with no religion tend to be younger. We've considered things like education, but even controlling for that, the nons have still got a higher rate of response via the internet. Interesting questions as to why that is. Is it something to do with secular values? Is it something else to do perhaps with the sorts of people who fall into the non-category? Are people who are religious more likely to be socially conservative or technically conservative? I don't know. Those are just random thoughts, but there's something going on there which I think is interesting. Finally, well, it's not actually finally, there's actually another, I think 2 or 3 to go before you all fall off your perches on a Friday afternoon. But finally, oh sorry, I said finally, let's say it again. Second from last or third from last or something. I've got stuff here on a dress change. It's the sort of thing that you'd sort of expect, isn't it? Okay, so more mobile people, they tend to be younger, tend to be more qualified. Migration's socially selective, we all know that. It's demographically selective, it's socially selective, yeah? And you'd think it would select for people who are basically, more likely to be open to internet responses. Younger, more technically adept, more mobile and so on. Falling into some of the categories we identified in that table. And we see that in the raw data. Controlling for everything else, looking at the composition of the population, controlling for that, we actually see that it doesn't make any difference if people have moved in the past year from outside Northern Ireland compared to people who've stayed put. Actually, people who've changed address in Northern Ireland seem to be less likely controlling for everything else to respond via the internet. I think that's an interesting finding. I'm trying to work out what it means and why. Now, I'm not going to kill you here, but there's clear differences, obviously, by economic activity. So students are actually sort of doing fairly well here in the raw data, but relative to the employed, most groups seem to be down. And that's actually interesting as well. So the raw data, students are doing better. The raw data, lots of groups are doing less well than people are employees. And it persists, but to a lesser degree once we control for the other factors. Ethnicity. The differential is significant after controls. This is something that's noted in other contexts, in other countries. So ethnic minorities tend to be more likely to respond via the internet to censuses. Now, is that because ethnic minority groups are more likely to be longer distance migrants, longer term migrants? Is it that they're using internet technologies to keep in contact with home, things like Skype and stuff like that? But it's consistent with what we see elsewhere in other parts of the world. So, concluding comments. Large effects for age, family size, education, location, economic activity and ethnicity. Large raw effect for address change, but not after adjustment in the model, which is interesting. The age effect is exaggerated by lower computer ownership and broadband access for the older age groups. So the decline is exaggerated simply because those older age groups don't have computers. There will be interesting things to observe if we think how the population is going to age forward and how the demographic trends, the things that are happening, are going to shift the composition of the population in the next few years. So some of the trends may shift some people to be more likely to respond via the internet. Some may shift people away from those groups, which are more likely to respond via the internet. It would be absolutely great if we could have done a two-stage analysis where we could have looked at people on the basis, first of all the population, and then just those with computers. So we get sort of a better sense perhaps of attitudes and orientation towards the use of internet for data work and data collection and interaction with the government, rather than that mixed up with people not having computers. And another way to take the work a little bit further forward would be if we could actually analyse the data in a multi-level framework, which might add a little bit. It might actually give us better estimates. But I think the estimates and the stuff we got are okay, but it might be sort of interesting to try that as a way further forward. So, that's finished what I got to say. Thank you.
Yes, let's take one or two questions now, and then we'll hand over to Oliver. Is there any questions for Ian? No?
How was it that, or was the way that the census was advertised in the UK, was it the same in all the countries? Did everyone have the same information about the fact that you could do it on the internet and all that kind of stuff?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah.
Any more questions for you?
In terms of the characteristics of people not likely to respond, there's nothing really that stopped you?
No, nothing really.
That's
No.
in with the literature.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, some of it fitted in, most of it fitted in with what you saw elsewhere, even in international contexts. So in New Zealand, it's people who are sort of immigrants, different. Maoris had a lower response rate in New Zealand. The host population sort of was a medium level, but immigrants who you might sort of classify as being ethnic, non-New Zealand ethnic minorities had higher internet response rates. So I mean, that didn't surprise me. The age effects didn't surprise me. The same rurality effects are being seen sort of in New Zealand and elsewhere as well. So those are sort of quite big effects that you see sort of everywhere in the literature. I mean, I'm not quite sure what's happening with regard to the religion issue here as to what that is. I mean, what's going on there, and exactly what the demographics of the non-group is, and how that might sort of interact and affect whether you respond to a government data collection exercise via the internet. I mean, we control for age, we control for a variety of other things, so it's something we've not controlled for in the model, which might be something you can't control for, which is maybe something that's not collected in the census, so we don't know.
Sort of in terms of 2011, with sort of 15% responses online. Comparing that internationally, we have done fairly well.
Yeah.
In New Zealand, the first time, 7%.
Yeah.
So it has laid a good foundation to build on. Would you agree with?
Well, I think it is a good foundation. I can't remember actually when the New Zealand 7% was. I think they were doing a lot better in the most recent one, didn't they?
Yeah.
So they're actually quite a lot higher in the most recent one. And of course, it's a more fertile ground now because internet technology is becoming more pervasive in computers. Yes, it is a good foundation. And I suppose the moot point, or the thing to calculate, will be how the cumulative effects of demographic and social change by 2021 will interact with those factors, and how sort of it will lead to make it maybe more easier for some groups to respond and less easy. I'm not quite sure as well, thinking about sort of traditional hard to enumerate groups and why they're hard to enumerate, how that interacts and relates with internet contact and internet access as well. I think that probably needs a little bit more thought. I need to think about it.
And also, sort of the final point of design, 2011 was not internet friendly, if you like. It gave people the option.
Yeah.
You know, if you push people into responding on the internet, i.e. not giving them a form in the first instance,
Yeah.
If
If you forced them, you could do that.
yeah.
But you could force older people and those who don't have a computer or broadband it wouldn't work with them because they couldn't physically do it.
Well, both is maybe too strong.
Yeah. No, you could strongly encourage and make it sort of the only way you could respond.
Well, that's what they did in Canada.
Yeah.
For a couple of years.
Yeah, so you could do that, but it will run into the constraints that some groups, you just won't be able to sort of get them to encourage to respond because they don't have the data. Oh, sorry, they don't have the physical wherewithal to do so. So we're going to probably have to divert special efforts and approaches to deal with specific demographic groups. And, you know, I don't know what the position will be in 2021 with regard to broadband access and speed in the country. I mean, if it speeds up, it might make it a lot easier to do sort of fairly complex forms and stuff. But I know sort of, you know, I'm from a small village in Lincolnshire, and the broadband there that my cousin uses is extremely slow. And the phone reception's bloody hopeless and everything, you know, it's really hard to do stuff. So there's a big rollout in the digitisation of the West, say, Northern Ireland. It might make things a lot easier. The moot question I've got actually is how far you'll probably still need an address base, an accurate address base, even to administer an internet-based census. So some of the constraints might hold, so I'm not quite sure whether we're getting sort of adding difficulties to the problems we've got, or how they're going to interact with them. Yes.
Ian, ethnicity, was the PIAC study was done recently, an international study of adult literacy and numeracy. Yeah. It looked at ethnicity, and it found that ethnicity was positively associated with good numeracy and good literacy, except where the person didn't have good command of English. Were you able to look at ethnicity and language?
Not in this case, we didn't, and maybe it's something we should do, potentially. We did look at sort of the language that was used. We just looked at sort of, you know, we looked at country of birth. We had a white, non-white dichotomy. We didn't use language. Maybe we should have done.
I'll maybe pick that point up at the end.
Okay.
We're going to hand over to Oliver now.
Yeah.
He's going to look at this from an England and Wales perspective, but also maybe a longitudinal perspective as well.
This is the. Okay, thanks. So I'm sort of carrying on from what Ian was saying, looking at internet response, first of all from an England and Wales point of view, but also trying to explore some of the longitudinal aspects. That's just our general thanks, and sort of as Ian said, I'd also like to note my thanks to the people at Celsius and ONS who turned around some of these tables fairly quickly. And as we've heard, 2011 was the first UK census to be online, and we expect the 2021 census to be predominantly online. And I think there's a thing we can explore there about how that might happen. Whether you go for giving a form to every household and trying to get as many as possible to do it online, or whether you go for a sort of higher risk, not giving a form to households that you think will use the internet. So by way of context, we've discussed some of this. Two countries that aren't the only ones who've used internet censuses are Australia and Canada. In both cases, there's been a big increase in the two that they've done. So from Australia, there was a 9% household response in 2006, going up to 33% in 2011. In both cases, Canberra was the highest region and Northern Territories was the lowest response region. But Northern Territories went from 66% to 28%, so that's a big increase in a region that has all the hallmarks you think of a lower responding region. Canada went from 18% in 2006 to 54% in 2011, albeit with the 2011 Canadian census being different from earlier censuses. So, before we go on to look at the England and Wales, because I've got a slide here about advantages and disadvantages of internet censuses, which Ian's already covered most of this, I think, so I won't dwell on it. A couple of things I'll pick out. One is about question rewording. One of the questions that ONS found that people had trouble with, and I'm sure was the same here, was the relationship matrix of saying how, on the paper form, how is person 1 related to person 3, which is quite a confusing thing and is easy to get mixed up the wrong way around. if you reword the form automatically to say, how is Bob related to Sue? Or Bob is, select one of these of Sue, father, husband, child, whatever. That might make the quality of response improved. Another aspect is that these are born digital data. So there isn't the delay in capturing and scanning and processing them. Clearly the write-in or type-in responses to some questions needs to be analysed properly and coded in the same way that they would for scans data, but this takes out a lot of those steps. There's a risk of duplicate records. That's possible in the past with visitors being recorded in more than one place. But there is the possibility of households doing both paper-based responses and internet responses, and you have to work out which set of data to use. So I'm starting off with some cross-sectional data that's taken from a ONS report from 2012. The secure samples of anonymised records, ONS are now soliciting applications to use those. That's a 10% sample, and we'll be able to look in far greater depth on sort of bespoke aspects of a cross-sectional analysis. And the bit I'll come on to later is looking at the longitudinal studies and what that can tell us. So first of all, there was some information about when the form was filled in that I thought was quite interesting. Because in the past, we've not really had any way of telling when people fill in their paper form, which might seem entirely pedantic, but is quite interesting in terms of babies and when they're born. And if you fill in your census form several weeks after the census, but your baby was born sometime in that period, you shouldn't include the baby on the census because it wasn't born on the census day. In practice, my understanding is that people often forget the baby because they've got more things to worry about, I guess. But it's interesting now that we can see this data that there's a really strong focus on doing it on the census day itself, which is nice to see. The age of people who completed the form. This is similar to the graph that Ian showed. This is red and blue, and this might not come out very well if you're at the back. But we've got four not household reference persons. The person who was the first person on the form in England and Wales, which is usually the household reference person. What proportion of those people filled in the census either by on paper or by internet? So the first group here, 0 to 16-year-olds, very few household reference persons who'd be 0 to 16, but a few maybe. Sort of about 8% of those filled in the form, filled in the census via the internet. But that's a much smaller group in terms of absolute numbers than some of the other groups. The highest is the 26 to 35-year-olds, and about 27-ish% of those chose the internet option. Again, another thing that Ian identified, large households, and this is certainly the most dramatic split we see. Large households were far more likely to fill in the census online. The graph, the bar on the right-hand most side of this is for households with 7 or more people. The form in England and Wales went up to 6 people, the paper form, and then you needed to get an extension form if your household was larger. So I think there was a huge incentive to do it online because that was then much easier than trying to get another census form to complete your household. So that's about 60% of households with 7 or more people completed the census online, according to this data. Obviously, those households themselves are a small absolute fraction of all households in the country. Looking at some of the ranges where people filled in, as Ian said, we've got a very similar range looking at the LSOA level. The lowest was 5.7%, the highest was 54.8% of, I think this is of people rather than households. And there were 3 LSOAs in England and Wales with a greater than 50% response rate. There's a map here that I'm afraid I've had to like a suspect on a news broadcast. I've had to block out Wales because I realised last night that I'd got the shading completely wrong for Wales, so I apologise for that. If you're interested in Wales, the highest response rates were all in Cardiff. But we see a pattern that's this sort of corridor to the south and west of London that's most strongly shaded in, and we pick out urban areas as well. This is a graph of some data from Wales that is correct. It's the Welsh, the internet response rate for people completing their form in Welsh by the internet response rate for people completing their form in English. Most of the people down here clustered together, but what we can see is if there was a high Welsh return, then there was a low English return, and vice versa. But that's just to do with clustering and the sort of clustering of language areas in Wales, I think. This is from a graph from ONS quarterly internet usage data from a survey from 2006 through to 2012, showing the proportion of people who said in their survey that they'd never used the internet. And it declines from about 36% to about 17%. But the thing that concerns me about this graph is that it appears to be fairly asymptotic, or heading towards an asymptote. It suggests that there's a percentage of people, there'll always be a percentage of people who never use the internet, if that graph is to be believed. And that's quite worrying if we want more people to fill in the census form online. Okay, so moving on to the LS, which was my interest. So the LS, this is just a sort of standard image. The LS links people across various censuses. In England and Wales, we've got a 1% sample of the population. So if you're on one of the LS birth dates, then we have your census form data from 1971 through to 2011, or for as many of those censuses as you were present. And the thing that interests me are two questions. One is, can we learn more about the characteristics of people who filled in their form online in 2011 by looking at longitudinal characteristics of those people? And that might include their family characteristics, so things like the educational level of your parents rather than you, as to whether you fill in the form online. And also something like your mobility history, about how often, how frequently you've moved between censuses. Which is something pertaining to you, not to your family, but something that we can only really see in the LS rather than in cross-sectional data. The other thing that interests me is a second question here that's a bit unwieldy, but I've said, can we identify people likely to fill in an internet form who might otherwise not have filled in a paper form? What I'm interested in is the idea of, if you make the internet option available, will that encourage some people to complete the census who wouldn't have done so otherwise? And the way I've looked at that is to look for people in the past who weren't in the census, who then reappear in 2011. And I've called them missing reappeared people. And they have a sort of pattern that you see them in one census, they disappear in the next census, and then you see them again in 2011. And there's entirely legitimate reasons why that might happen. They might have moved out of England and Wales and filled in their census in Scotland or Northern Ireland. They might have moved out to the UK and come back again. But another reason is that they might have filled in their census in England and Wales and the data wasn't linked properly. But for some people, it might be because they were avoiding the census. And I think these people are quite interesting, because these are the people we're trying to capture in 2021. So this is data from the LS about presence in the census, or in the LS sample, rather. So we've got about 200,000 people who have been present throughout in our data from 1971 onwards. And then I've got various different totals for observations of people in smaller numbers of censuses. The second block of data here are for people who are missing from one census. So we have about 9,500 people who were present in 71. We couldn't find them in 1981, but they've been present from 1991 onwards. And about 11, nearly 12,000 people who've been present since 1971, apart from 2001, where they appeared to disappear. That's something odd thing to say. And then reappeared in 2011. And then finally, I've got some cases where they disappeared for 2 censuses. And we can actually look at this in more detail. We can look at people who weren't necessarily present all the way through from 1971. The simplest approach to looking at this idea of missingness is to concentrate on a simple example, which is you were present in 1991, you were or weren't present in 2001, and then you were present again in 2011. So I look in 2011 at people who used either paper or internet to respond to the census. And I've divided people into those who were present in 2001 and those who weren't present in 2001, or who weren't linked and captured in the LS sample. And what I find is that of those people who weren't linked in 2001, a higher proportion of those people filled in the form in 2011 online. And that difference is statistically significant. So that seems to suggest that those people who weren't in the census for one reason or another, they weren't in the UK, they avoided the census, their data wasn't captured properly, they seem to be more likely to be internet responders in 2011, which is encouraging if we want more people to respond to the census via the internet in 2021, that we're going to hopefully capture more missing people. That relationship's also true when we divide by gender. The relationship's significant both for men and for women, and again, those people who were missing in 2001 were more likely to use the internet in 2011 than those people who'd been present in 2001. I've also looked at this by age, and what I found there was that the 2 younger age groups I've got, 18 to 24 and 25 to 44-year-olds, there wasn't a statistically significant difference between those present or not present in 2001. Whereas for the 2 older groups, 45 to 64-year-olds and 60